Anthony Davis inadvertently was hit on the right side of his head on this play by Kevon Looney, and per Chris Haynes, had to actually be taken off the court back to the locker room in a wheelchair. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and my goal in this channel is to help teach you about the medical side of the sports world. So if this kind of thing interests you, then please consider subscribing to help support the channel. For all of the talk about Anthony Davis being injury prone, he is honestly just more unlucky than anything. This was a play where he catches this inadvertent forearm from Kevon Looney, and the announcers initially thought that he might have been inadvertently poked in the eye. But what it looks like happens here is Kevon Looney's left kind of wrist forearm just strikes Davis right on the right side of his face around the region of his eye, or the orbit. Now we'll talk about with our anatomy what area, what bones are going to be involved there trying to protect the head, but this did not look like an eye poke. It didn't look like he got scratched in the eye. My concern here would be with some sort of eye or orbital trauma, potentially orbital fracture, but at a minimum, a concussion. Here with Davis walking off the court, visibly distressed, sort of holding his head down. At one point, he kind of just had that classic head in his hands, looking down at the ground, not wanting to open his eyes. These are all concerning features of a possible concussion. We heard on the broadcast per Chris Haynes that Davis actually had to be taken off the court in a wheelchair because it looked like he was having trouble with his balance. Now, you can have difficulty with your balance because of purely a visual problem, which we'll review also with our anatomy. But of course, dizziness, loss of balance after getting hit in the head is a very concerning sign of a possible concussion. Davis makes a little motion here where he kind of moves his hand side to side as he's talking to the athletic trainer, almost like something with his vision or something is off kilter. And then as Davis looks up here, again, we see that look in the face of just almost being a little bit absent, a classic sign like we'll see with somebody who might have a concussion. I think there's real concern that Davis could miss some time, even if we're just dealing with a concussion. We'll talk about that and the anatomy of this injury, but first I want to give a quick shout out to the sponsor of this video. This video is sponsored by NordVPN. A VPN keeps you safe and secure while you're on the internet. And for me, it doesn't get any better than the features and security of NordVPN. First of all, it's extremely simple to use, whether you're on a computer or a mobile device. All I have to do on my phone is open up the app, and right away I can browse through a map to see which location I want to connect to. All you have to do is then choose your location, quick to connect, and within seconds, you're gonna be secure and safe with your internet activity. I've struggled with other VPN services slowing down my internet to the point where I don't even wanna use it, but with NordVPN, you're getting the fastest VPN service out there. But that's not all, because NordVPN is more than just a VPN. With their threat protection feature enabled, you're gonna get additional security with things like malware blocking and always-on cybersecurity, even when you're not connected to their VPN. Right now, if you go to nordvpn.com/BrianMD, you can get an exclusive deal with 4 months free on a 2-year plan. And it's completely risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Internet security is one of those things that if you don't have it, unfortunately, it can be too late if somebody does try to steal your data. So protect yourself at all times while you're on the internet with what, in my opinion, is the easiest to use and best VPN out there, NordVPN. Looking at our biodigital anatomy tool here, I think the first thing to focus on really acutely for Davis is the possibility of some sort of facial trauma, something like an orbital fracture. This is going to be the right side of the skull over here, and this is right where Kevon Looney's arm struck Davis, just to the right side of that eye. In this region, this bone is called the zygomatic bone. It comes together with the maxilla and then the temporal bone here, and then deep to that, the sphenoid bone. But all of this is going to be part of the orbital socket, the area that the eyeball sits inside within the skull. Now, our eye is recessed like this in part because we need to protect it. And so we have these bones built up around the eye so that if a shot does come in towards the eye, it's absorbed into the skull rather than hitting the eye itself. Now, you can have, of course, a fracture to this bone, which is something that, depending on how severe it is, you can sometimes just wear a mask and be okay. But we also have to worry about the possibility of orbital or eye trauma. Whenever an impact comes into the side of the skull, initially the bone is going to absorb some of the energy, but then it's also going to get transmitted further along into the orbit. We can have things like actual tears of the eyeball itself, injuries to the retina on the back of the eye, and so part of this evaluation has to include just evaluation for a possible ocular or eye injury. I don't think this is anything like a corneal abrasion, which is just a scratch of the eye, because again, there was no real direct contact or rubbing on the front part of Davis's eye. From a concussion standpoint, let's talk about that mechanism. The brain sits inside the skull, surrounded by this stuff called cerebral spinal fluid. It's sort of the cushion that helps keep the brain nice and protected. Whenever this impact comes in here from Looney, initially AD's head is going to be stationary. That load comes in, strikes his skull, and then there's a movement in the skull where the brain is going to stay in place. And then after the skull moves, the brain starts to move, and the brain kind of gets this trauma. It can hit against the inside of the skull. You get this force transmitted through the different neurons within the brain, which can lead to a concussion. I will say there's not as much true whiplash like we'll see in some concussions, where there's a real aggressive, violent head jerk and then stop, like when somebody's knocked out in boxing or combat sports. And so I'm hopeful that maybe this is not a concussion and more just some temporary, pain or insult to the eye. But that's the general gist of what's going to happen with a concussion. There's some sort of external load, comes in, hits the brain, the skull is going to move, the brain gets jolted from the inside, this energy goes through the brain, disrupts the nerve cells, and everything just kind of resets within the brain, followed by all the symptoms. The big question here, of course, is how much time could Anthony Davis miss? The NBA concussion protocol is a little bit more vague compared to something like the NFL. The NFL has a very clear 5-step process where you typically advance one step, one day at a time, and so often the minimum amount of time you can miss would be 1 week. In the NFL, that means you could be back for the following game. But of course, in the NBA, when there's another game in just a couple of days, that would keep you out. But the NBA doesn't clearly outline as much detail with how long that return process has to take. It has to be gradual. It has to be in a stepwise manner once the athlete or Anthony Davis is asymptomatic, but there's not as strict of guidelines with how long it has to take place over. Now, with a concussion, oftentimes symptoms can be delayed, and so the Lakers will have to check in with him tomorrow, see if he's developing any new symptoms, even if they don't diagnose him with a concussion today. But it sort of enters this little gray area because, again, we might not hear a firm set specific diagnosis. We might just hear head injury, which after what we saw could be as simple as a bruise or a contusion to the bones like we talked about earlier, or something like a concussion. Based on just how Davis looked, how he was feeling, I would be surprised if symptoms resolve quickly enough to where he's able to ramp back up and play in a couple of days, assuming that he is diagnosed with a concussion. I hope he's not. Hopefully this is just a temporary bruise to the skull. Your vision is also going to affect your balance because of course you need to see what's around you. And so if you have a temporary injury to the eye, you could have difficulty with balance. So that might also be playing into this. Definitely concerning when we hear somebody has to be taken off the court in a wheelchair because of concerns with their balance. This should not at all contribute to any talk about Anthony Davis being injury prone. This was another fluky play. There's nothing you can do to train your brain to be more resilient, so to speak, to an impact to prevent something like a concussion if he does have one. This is just bad luck that unfortunately has happened at a bad time. That's it for the video, everybody. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below. And until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.